I would like to hear your story when flying over Indonesia's territory later. But before that, I would like to hear, because flying came later in your life, isn't it? Like, well, I mean, why then and not earlier?
Well, the expeditions came later, but actually I always flew.
Okay.
And I can't honestly pinpoint the point at which I thought I want to fly, because I don't come from an aviation family. I had simply no exposure to it. Although I was born in Britain, we emigrated to Canada in the early 1960s, and I was raised in the outback. So I understood mobility at a very early age. I'd crossed the Atlantic twice before I was 11.
Right.
So I loved mobility. And so I'm very grateful for that early part in my life. But I had no exposure to aviation beyond the fact that my father took us to an air show in Canada. My two sisters, I'm one of three daughters, and my younger brother was born in Canada. So while he was being born, literally, my father would take my sisters and I to a couple of air shows. So that was my first sense of aviation.
You were 11.
I was probably younger than that, 7 or 8,
yes.
6 or 7 when I went to an air show. And then when I was 16, my twin sister and I went back to Canada. That was my first experience of flying in an airliner, which was absolutely transporting, literally and metaphorically speaking. And of course, in those days, you could still go up to the cockpit. So I was out of my seat into the cockpit, completely entranced by the experience, the view. And of course, that was in fact when I had my first flying lesson. I had seen a sign at the side of the road, advertising an introductory flight for $15. So while my twin sister went shopping, I went and had my first flight. So in fact, it started very young.
It's really interesting how memory capture and develop in a young age, basically stayed, forever in a way. But do you think that you inherit the nature, courageous nature and adventure natures from your parents or ancestors, or did you develop it throughout your life?
I think one is perhaps born with a sense of, I mean, who knows, the whole nature nurture argument, who knows? But much later, I discovered that, my family were predominantly naval, both Royal Navy and Merchant Navy. And during the 18th century were captains of the old clippers that would, do the tea run to China. So I like to think that there was a connection with the sailors.
And actually the courageous nature of sailors, of course.
The outgoing, the whole business, when you see the old sailing ships, there is a kind of similarity with flight, I think. So maybe it's somewhere there in the genetics. But I was also deeply impressed by films, a couple of films that I saw, which made a huge impression. Of course, I was an avid reader. So I was reading about World War I and the really early days of aviation. So it gripped me pretty early on, I have to say, but I never imagined that I would go on to fly. This was still just an idea that excited me.
Yes.